The car. It has become ingrained in our everyday lives, but only 120 years ago it was a toy for wealthy idlers, and now the ability to drive is a necessity for the modern person. Indeed, you might consider cars one of the engines for progress. New technologies are continuously being developed for them. Logistics are continuously improved for their manufacturing. Our cities are transformed beyond recognition to adapt to them. It's enough to look out the window with that thought. Broad streets, traffic lights, filling stations, parking lots. But once a story happened because of which cars in general almost led humanity to an ecological collapse. And cars weren't to blame for it. They kept serving people. They helped some get from job to home, others deliver food from store to kitchen, and they just gave bright emotions to others. This is all people's fault and their desire to make money. Make yourself comfortable. From this video, you'll find out how a person who was born at the farm in the years of the Civil War could get all America behind the wheel in the future. How and why did steam cars and electric cars lose a war to ice in a smashing way? How did champions of sobriety influence the energy industry? And how did one of the inventors of the atomic bomb save us from ecological collapse? In this world, nothing happens for the sake of it. Everything has a reason. Those reasons are obvious in the simple things, but this is not the case here for sure. And to understand these reasons, we need to go back to the very start of car manufacturing. "160 years ago, back when Henry Ford was born, no one could have ever imagined the global changes in industry and culture that would take place over the next 10 to 20 years. Not to mention Henry's role in such changes. The United States has become the world's most automobile country, although in geographical terms, the automobile was first developed in Europe. However, it was nothing more than a means of transportation. Ford's contribution to the emergence of a new automobile culture is enormous, and here's why. This story began in 1863, when America was facing challenging and turbulent times. The Civil War was in full swing. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, a family of Michigan farmers had their first child. The boy was named Henry. 1876 was a life-changing year for Henry. He lost his mother at the age of 13, but also got a hint of what path he would take for the next years of his life. The hint, rumbling and fuming, passed his father's wagon on the way to Detroit. It was a locomobile. Just to make it clearer, a locomobile is a tractor with a steam boiler instead of the common gasoline engine. Henry started to pick the machinist's brains about it. Proud of such an engineering marvel, he eagerly told the boy the way the steam wagon worked. If not for that event, there might not have been any Ford Motor Company. In 1878, without saying a word, 16-year-old Henry left for Detroit. After working here and there and gaining experience, he was hired as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, founded by the brilliant Thomas Edison. Yes, the very Thomas Edison. In case you don't know anything about Edison, he was one of the major inventors of his time. Incandescent light bulbs, movie cameras, and the first music players. He was involved in the invention of all those things. We will talk about him in our upcoming videos. Well, let's get back to Henry. He was 30 years old, and it was 1893. A German Otto two-cylinder engine ended up in his hands, so he redesigned the engine and adapted it to a four-wheeled, self-propelled carriage. It was Henry Ford's first vehicle that could properly travel. Just think about it. It was 1893. There was no internet, no dedicated literature, not even a mentor. Nevertheless, Henry did it. It was a great success. The Edison Illuminating Company management didn't approve of the chief engineer's hobbies, and as a result, Henry resigned in 1899, when the choice of priorities had become a point-blank question. After all, Henry sold his first vehicle so he could get the money for constructing an improved model, a delivery van. Backed by the mayor of Detroit and assisted by several businessmen, Ford managed to accumulate enough money to create the Detroit Motor Company. In that project, Henry assigned himself the role of a common engineer with a salary of $150 a month. A year later, after selling only 22 cars, the company collapsed. The cars were expensive and inferior to their competitors. No sales, so Ford decided to stimulate them, dedicating himself to the construction of sports cars. He chose sports cars for one simple reason. Winning a race or even setting a record was the best advertising for any car company at that time. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday, Henry said. Ford's first car was ready in 1901, just in time for the start of the 10-mile circuit races. The race was won, and the prize fund was used to establish his own company, Ford Motor Company. But that was only the beginning. In 1902, Henry built 2 more cars that made him famous all over America, Ford 999 and Ford Arrow. The cars had identical structure. The first was fiery red, while the second one was bright yellow. Each had an 18.8-liter engine. 18.8 liters! The Dodge Challenger with its 6.2 looks like a little economy car. The only problem was to find a madman who would agree to drive this 100-horsepower monster on wheels without a body, brakes, and fairings. So, meet Tom Cooper, a cyclist, 1898 and 1899 cycling champion. When Henry showed him his beast, he was a bit shocked. He probably thought it should be called Ford 666. Later, Tom asked Barney Oldfield to race him, upon which he heard, "Hold my beer." Then, in 1902, he finished first in the 8-kilometer race. A nationwide reputation was gained. The charter capital for the new company derived mostly from the money won, and the road to realizing the dreams of the young Henry Ford was opened. June 16, 1903 is considered to be the date of the Ford Motor Company's founding. In theory, it is so. With the money raised from winning races and the help of a coal magnate, Henry managed to hire 12 workers, but the car assembly still took place in a brick garage of 76 by 15 meters on Mack Avenue. So far, it has been a subassembly of cars from third-party components. The next step to the crown of America's automobile king was the purchase of a controlling 51% stock. For those who don't quite understand what stock is and why it was necessary to buy the 51% stock, let me explain. A stock is a share in a company. The percentage of stock you own is your share in the company. The bigger part of the company you own, the more control you have over it. And if you have that 51% of the stock, that means you own most of the company. So whatever you say will happen. So let's proceed with our story. On November 22, 1905, Henry finally managed to buy 51% of the stock. However, he was forced to sacrifice the revenues from selling the already successful Model N. Instead, he completely abandoned any third-party components. Ford was on its way to full independence. This process ended only in 1913. Even though orders for the Model N increased greatly, the work on the Model T started in the experimental room of Ford's factory on Paquette Avenue about 2 years before the car was announced to dealers on March 19th. The car was the brainchild of a 12-member engineering team led by Ford. The Model T was first presented to dealers on October 1st, 1908, with prices ranging from $825 to $1,000 depending on body type. The design of the Tin Lizzie, as it was affectionately called by customers, was extremely innovative and reliable. The frame was pressed from strong, lightweight, vanadium alloyed steel. The frame featured a 4-cylinder engine based on a cast cylinder block, which was another outstanding feature for that time. Not to mention the specifications of the 2.9-liter engine. It produced 20 horses and could accelerate the car up to 45 miles per hour. In the past, shifting gears was a real mess. Ford developed a special gearbox for the Model T with simple and easy-to-understand pedal controls. There was no need for a clutch at all because the pedal had 3 positions: neutral, downshift, and upshift. There was also a brake pedal. Instead of a gas pedal, there was a lever behind the steering wheel. In modern cars, there is a lever to control the windshield wipers. That was enough to teach any kind of farmer how to drive a Ford in a couple of hours. Similar cars in the U.S. market were worth at least $2,000, so only a banker's son could afford such expenses. It was simply impossible to buy such a car for $800 and later for $500. That's why the Tin Lizzie attracted queues of farmers, clerks, salesmen, and people who just cared about their freedom of movement. We are not surprised by the enormous sales of the Model T. Only in 1909, more than 12,000 cars were sold. The next year, 19,000, and by 1912, the total annual production of Ford cars was 70,000 items. Tin Lizzie was about 90% of the world's car fleet, and that was the car that put the world on wheels. The price of the base version had dropped to $290 by the time the last Model T rolled off the assembly line on May 27, 1927, and 15 million cars had been sold. Only the Volkswagen Beetle was able to surpass that record in the greatly expanded market after World War II. Wait. How is this possible? How many people do you need to attract in order to assemble each year 500,000 cars in craftsman conditions, then sell them at a minimal price and make a good profit? That's what Henry Ford is all about. He developed the idea of the flow production process, implementing it in its most efficient manner by 1913. Simply put, he almost invented the assembly line and managed to make the assembly process several times cheaper and faster. In the 260-meter-squared factory, there were light and perfectly ventilated halls in which belt conveyors were installed. The frame was installed at the beginning of the conveyor belt, and at the end of the belt, a finished car was pulled out. Each worker performed a specific operation. It was not a big deal. Once the part was delivered, the worker installed it, and the conveyor belt supplied the next vehicle. No extra fuss, no squatting, and no hustling around the workshop. Production and assembly steps were organized sequentially so that parts were transported to the assembly point by the shortest route without any hassle. This reduced the chassis assembly time from 12.5 hours in October to 2 hours and 40 minutes by December 30th, 1913. Every part in the shop moves, boasted Ford in 1922. By purchasing parts in large quantities, Henry was able to reduce their price. Moreover, thanks to such highly optimized production, the cost of the finished product was not much different from the cost of the parts. A 15-minute lunch break, including time to go to the bathroom, was the only break in the boring routine of monotonous work. But the workers were paid $5 a day, working only 8 hours, which were the best conditions in the United States. Rigid cost control and time-saving production of the Model T sometimes reached absurdity. It is known that for a certain period, Tin Lizzie was sold only in black, simply because black dye was the cheapest option and lacquer with black pigment dried much faster. Henry Ford's statement that any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants as long as it is black is related to this. This phrase indeed was relevant, but only between 1909 and 1914, when the Tin Lizzie's circulation was enormous. By 1927, Ford had become the sole proprietor of the entire production cycle, starting with ore mining and ending with the production of electrical components. By this time, the Tin Lizzie had become obsolete and was replaced on the assembly lines of Ford's plants by the Model A. The Ford A failed to beat the record of the Tin Lizzie, but it was also sold quite well, both in the States and in Europe. The price of the base model at the time was $390. The car was sold in more than 20 configurations, and more than 5 million copies were sold between 1927 and 1931. Also, the Ford A is famous for the fact that it was the first mass-produced all-metal V8 engine block, thereby marking the era of the V8 among American automakers. The Model A was still at the forefront of the global automotive industry in many aspects, but Henry's days ticked away. His son Edsel became the company's manager. The model range expanded, the world market faced global changes due to wars, but we will remember Ford cars as the world's first affordable, reliable, and unpretentious vehicle that gave millions of simple people the freedom to travel. As we have seen, Henry was a true engineer. Ford Model T still had a lot of years driving the roads of America, let alone that some people drive it even today. But besides Henry, there was another man who saw prospects in the car industry. If anyone ever tries to write the history of the United States without mentioning General Motors, then you are facing an enemy of all progressive mankind. Leave this libel aside and don't even think about it. General Motors, with all its ups and downs, has been keeping up with American history for more than a century, embodying the American lifestyle. The origins of this corporation, as well as its development stages, were also very America-like. This doesn't mean that Buick ranks higher among the General Motors brands, it is just that historically in 1899, another small batch workshop was created in Detroit, which assembled petrol wagons out of whatever was available and tried to sell them at a higher price. The name of this joint was Buick Auto Vim and Power Company. They repaired and assembled gasoline engines there, which were sometimes mounted on a frame with bicycle wheels. The company was not even registered. Among its employees, there was also engineer Walter Marr, who built the company's first car. The car was named Buick, in honor of the company's director and founder, David Dunbar Buick. As you may have noticed, at that time there was a trend to give companies the last names of their founders. Officially, the company had been operating since 1903, when the director decided to move production from Detroit to his hometown of Flint, also in Michigan. Ironically, the company registration process almost coincided with the announcement of its bankruptcy in 1904. On the other hand, it is not so surprising, since there were a lot of competitors at the time, in particular Ford, Dodge, and Cadillac. No one knows how this story would have ended if not for third-party help provided by effective management. Well, this pertains to another story, not quite a car story. The persona of William Crapo Durant is supposed to stand beside that of Henry Ford in the list of creators of American automobile history. Durant was born on December 8, 1861 in Boston, Massachusetts. He never finished school because he needed the money. He worked at his grandfather's sawmill, who, by the way, had been governor of Michigan until 1868. Durant quickly realized that cutting boards didn't bring him much money, so he partnered with Josiah Dallas Dort, and together they set up the Flint Road Cart Company, involved in making horse-drawn vehicles. Durant had only $1,500 in his pocket, and most of it was borrowed. He invested every penny he had in his business. Things went well. The company in Flint sold 50,000 strollers a year, almost becoming a national industry leader. However, who cares about a horse-drawn carriage when there's an automotive story going on in Flint and neighboring Detroit? The money is different here. So Durant started buying up small car companies, most of them craftsmen, which couldn't survive under tough competition. This is where the paths of the Durant businessman and the sinking Buick company crossed. The company was bought out and brought back in the market. Olds Motor Vehicle Company Incorporated is another branch that reinforced the Durant Corporation. The company is considered the oldest in the United States because its first car was built as early as 1887 by one of its founders, Ransom Olds. 2 years later, he announced the merger of his two companies, Olds Motor Vehicle and Olds Gasoline Engine Works of Lansing, with a registered capital of $500,000. Thus, Olds Motor Works was formed in 1890. A few years later, the company built a real manufacturing plant in Detroit, positioning itself as the manufacturer of the most luxurious cars in America. At that time, almost every company was trying to market itself that way. Good company, we should take it, thought William Durant, and bought a controlling stake from the Olds brothers. Thus, in 1907, Durant could declare the establishment of a powerful corporation to produce General Motors cars. And so, he did. Consequently, in 1907, a new American multi-brand corporation was announced. Durant's intentions still involved the purchase of Henry Ford's business. However, Ford neither shared the concept of General Motors management nor wanted to become dependent on investors again, something he had just started to get out of. Besides, he had his own vision for the development of the automobile industry in the United States, and we talked about it in a previous video on our channel. Henry Ford and William Durant clearly differ in their views. Ford's goal was to flood America with cheap but well-made cars that could be repaired in any rural workshop. Durant had bigger plans, since unlike Ford, he was an experienced businessman, not an engineer. He wanted different people to buy different cars, both expensive, very expensive, and cheap. Obviously, it was not enough to build one assembly line and put together one model in different configurations. The best thing would be if there were several brands. Each of these brands should gain a foothold in specific social groups. Each brand should define the status of the owner of the car, so that a buyer has always a space to further growing among his compatriots. It seems we got distracted. Anyway, Durant kept buying up automotive repair shops all along the coast. Thus, GM included Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, which would later be renamed Pontiac, Ewing, Marquette, and other cars, as well as Reliant and Rapid trucks. So, the dynasty evolved. As a result, on September 16, 1908, General Motors was almost fully formed. Almost, because all that was left to do was tame one more stubborn company. On November 3, 1911, the Chevrolet Motor Company of Michigan was incorporated in Detroit. It was founded by Louis Chevrolet, a strong man of Swiss descent. He was a natural-born racer and a pretty good engineer. Like everyone else, Louis wanted to sell more and invest less. For example, the first Chevy Classic 6 models released in 1912, 1913, and 1914 were almost identical. In 1912, the first year of Chevy production, they were priced at $2,150, a mind-boggling figure for that time. This was even though Ford was selling slightly more modest cars but 5 times cheaper. So how can we talk about conquering the market? Almost at the same time, in 1910, William Durant started to lose influence in the newly formed General Motors because of his debts to many banks. Simply put, the bankers' credit of trust in William was lost. Upon leaving the position as the head of the corporation, Durant did not give up the idea of developing the automobile concern, so he was looking for a way to apply his outstanding managerial skills. Fortunately, destiny offered him Lewis Chevrolet's company. Well, Lewis himself needed help. As a result, Chevrolet Motor Company showed good sales growth for the next few years, and new models with more affordable prices were introduced. New options like electric starter and electric lights also became available. Chevy production rose to 70,000 pieces in 1916 and 125,882 the following year. In 1917, the first Chevrolet V8 engine was introduced in the D Series. At this point, our attentive viewers are like, wait, in the previous video you said that Ford made the first mass-produced V8. Yes, Ford did make the first mass-produced V8, and Chevrolet only put it on custom and consequently expensive models. As one might expect, Lewis and William Durant took different paths. They disagreed on price and design. Durant was committed to developing cars for everyday use, while Chevrolet was more concerned with luxury cars. As a result of these disputes, Chevrolet sold its stock to Durant but kept the racer's name. This was what Durant wanted. Chevrolet became one of the most powerful manufacturers in the country. By 1916, Durant was ready to compete with other big names in the industry. In fact, the 1916 Chevrolet 490 was an attempt to compete with the Ford Model T. By then, Chevrolet was prospering, with production plants across the country, even in Flint and New York. With some help, Durant finally managed to buy General Motors stock. When we simply say bought shares and became the president of a corporation, only a few people understand what it all means. Theoretically, there is nothing complicated about it. In our video about Ford, we already mentioned this financial tool. If the company is privately owned and all its assets are owned by one person, then we would say that the teapot repair shop belongs to Mr. Teapot, for example. If Mr. Teapot decided to set up not only a repair shop but also the production of teapots, he would hardly possess enough money for machinery, raw materials, and labor. Therefore, the costs of production must be shared with someone. It could be a bank, it could be a private investor, or it could be a group of workers who, often unknowingly, own a piece of the enterprise. Each piece of property is expressed in shares, and the share is backed by real money. You can sell it, buy it, give it away, lose it while playing cards, and so on. So Durant didn't win General Motors stock at cards because he already had enough money. Durant regained the title of president of GM in 1917, and Chevrolet merged with General Motors as a separate unit. Over the next few years, General Motors improved its quality standards and expanded its model range. At the same time, Durant kept the division's priorities well separated. Cadillac had to produce only premium luxury cars at sky-high prices. Buick brand ranked second, whose cars were cheaper but also fell within the interests of wealthy businessmen and bankers. Pontiac was targeted to the middle class, and they also produced service cars, for example, for traffic police and other services. Chevrolet Motor Company always stood apart and enjoyed some liberties. Therefore, this brand had its own class of connoisseurs, and of course, Chevrolet covered the low-budget sector of the U.S. car fleet. Inexpensive cars, trucks, pickups, and later SUVs and buses, heavy trucks, and tractors. In short, GM was well prepared for the Great Depression. By this period, GM had developed the General Motors Truck Company, later known as GMC, Chevrolet Motor Company of Michigan, General Motors Export Company, and General Motors of Canada. Thanks to the increased capacity and numerous plants abroad, including Canada, China, Denmark, Belgium, Brazil, France, Germany, Australia, and South Africa, the 1929 Great Depression had little impact on General Motors. Moreover, the company managed to show growth and not slip out of the Big Three. What can I say? The guys from GM turned out to be fine businessmen, An arch rival for Uncle Henry Ford was established, so to say, and healthy competition is good for both products and you and me, the consumers. Of course, each of them needed to show off to attract buyers. Competition can also be unhealthy, but we'll talk more about that a bit later. Oh, but why are we talking about cars with internal combustion engines only? Since today alternatives are insistently making their way into the world, electric cars, interestingly, was there something similar at the turn of the century? Turns out there was. Given the examples of Ford and General Motors, we know what gasoline-powered cars drove on the road. Nevertheless, cars with steam and electric engines were also produced. Indeed, Henry Ford's cars cost many times less. Perhaps if Henry would have believed in the advantages of steam engines, the world would look very different now. However, things happened as they did, and history knows no if. So, Ford has flooded U.S. roads thanks to the low price of his products, but you can't beat a competitor with price only, especially if you're inferior to him in terms of usability. Just so you'll understand who the internal combustion engine competitor was, let's first say some words about steam cars. How do we imagine steam-powered cars? Slow, uncomfortable, with little range, and so on. What if I told you how in 1907 a record-breaking steam car rolled out of the Stanley Brothers workshop and managed to beat the competition? The Stanley Rocket model was driven on Oarsman Beach in Florida by racer Fred Marriott. The car showed a result of 127.6 miles per hour, which was the absolute world record for speed on land. There were also mass-produced light motor vehicles. For example, Doble Brothers at General Engineering were engaged in the design and production of light motorized steam cars with a sophisticated automatic boiler ignition system and a range of up to 1,200 miles. Just imagine, 1,200 miles! You fill up in Washington and drive all the way to Miami on the same filling, and you don't have to fill up on the way. It was a sensation. The engine took only a minute and a half to start, and after modifications, that time was reduced to 22 seconds. The maximum speed of the steam car was 100 miles per hour. However, such pleasure was not cheap. The company managed to sell about 7,000 copies of various modifications at prices starting at $18,000. To make it clear, $18,000 is $478,500 in today's money. Of course, there were cheaper cars, but their production volumes couldn't be compared with Ford's bestseller. But in addition to steam vehicles, there were also electric cars. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, electric propulsion looked more promising than the steam engine, not to mention the internal combustion engine. It was completely silent and didn't require any startup preparations. The owner could simply sit down and drive. The only thing steam engines and internal combustion engines could somehow challenge was range. 100 years later, nothing has changed. But back then, 24 miles was enough for city conditions, while horses were used for long journeys. Between 1900 and 1910 in New York City alone, almost the entire taxi fleet was electric. The share of electric cars was increasing among delivery, postal, medical carriages, and other transportation services. The fleet of electric trucks also continued to grow. Such vehicles could not only load thousands of pounds on a platform, but could also pull a trailer behind them. The only thing was that the price of an electric car, like the price of a steam car, was too high for the common worker. Such vehicles were affordable for prosperous businessmen and their wives. The electric transport was considered the most reliable. The only inconvenience was the heavy battery, which had to be constantly recharged. But that didn't scare off customers either. For example, the battery manufacturer Electric Storage Battery had its own network of charging stations offering maintenance of electric cars. The same company owned a network of taxis in New York City, and in Detroit there were more than 100 electric cars operating in the cab service. Well, what was wrong with the internal combustion engine cars? First of all, they were not equipped with mufflers, so the lack of noise insulation did not improve the comfort of use. But the biggest disadvantage was this thing. Those of you who are probably older know what it is. It's called a crooked starter. To start the engine, you had to approach the car, put this stick in the crankshaft, and start cranking. If you turned it hard enough, the crankshaft rotated, started moving the pistons, and the engine started. Have you ever seen lawnmowers started? You pull a rope and then the motor in it starts. This system is called a rope starter and it works the same way. But lawnmowers have a small motor, and the Ford Model T, as I hope you remember, has an engine capacity of 2.9 liters. It's not that easy to crank a motor like that. not everyone can cope with such exercise. Meanwhile, winter is a real disaster. You cranked the starter, nothing worked. Cranked it again and start moving, probably by cab. This was a rather strong argument against the internal combustion engine. And I remind you of one thing, whether it was an electric car or a steam-powered car, you walked up to it, sat down, and drove it. The invention of the starter was a breath of fresh air for drivers. It was first suggested for use by Clyde Kaufman back in 1899, but the presented design proved to be unsuccessful and unreliable. But already in 1911, the founder of the Delco Company will present the original design of the car starter for internal combustion engines. His name was Charles Kettering. I suggest you keep his name in mind because he will play a great part in our story. The presentation took place on June 15, 1911. Kettering showed the public a compact electric motor that could develop enough power to turn the crankshaft and accelerate it to the necessary rotation speeds for starting. Once started, the electric motor worked as a generator to charge the battery, 2-in-1. Cadillac was the first company to recognize the idea, and already in 1912, it implanted an electric starter in the new Cadillac Model 30. Once the other automobile manufacturers noticed this invention, everyone needed a starter. Everyone tried to negotiate with Delco to supply starters, but General Motors did the most impressive thing. As we remember, William Durant was buying up everything he could get his hands on. The Delco Company was also bought out and merged with GM. Besides heavy starting, the internal combustion engine was also just too noisy. This problem plagued the best minds in automotive engineering, but as it turned out, it was solved as early as 1897, when engineer-inventor Milton Reeves patented the internal combustion engine noise dampening system. The design turned out to be so effective, cheap to produce, and simple that it is used almost unchanged until the present day. Thus, cars with internal combustion engines were no longer inferior in comfort to steam and electric cars and cost many times less. However, the final nail in the coffin was an economic phenomenon that changed the world forever. Now, let's take our minds off cars and look at what was going on in the world back then. The period starting in October 1929 and lasting almost the next 10 years is known to the whole world as the Great Depression. These days, the pandemic makes us more aware of the economic downturn. So let's look at what happened to the economy back then and what pulled it out of the Depression. Our story begins in the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties. With the end of World War I, money flowed into the country. The defeated states paid war reparations, and the victorious ones paid loans that were spent on the Army's needs. Moreover, industrialization was in full swing. Enterprises like those we described earlier were growing like never before. People trusted companies so much that every butcher or janitor, not to mention bigger capital holders, wanted to invest their dollars in growing stocks. The key word here is stocks. In fact, they were the ones who ruined the big business prosperity, making it impossible for small businesses to grow. As we know, every share we buy must be backed by real money. Only in this case, the share has a certain meaning and value. The share's cost is constantly changing based on internal and external economic and political factors. In the mid to late 20s, the largest financial exchange moved from London to Wall Street in New York. There, some companies started to speculate and manipulate their stocks. Partly, this resulted in the mispricing of the real value of the securities. So by 1928, when the economy was still booming, some stocks began to depreciate and their holders were often left empty-handed. The economists even came up with the term financial bubble. In short, this is a situation when an investor either knowingly or unknowingly acts irrationally and purchases only to make a purchase. At the same time, he hopes that these shares can be sold later at a higher price, thus generating some cash. By buying shares, investors increase their demand, causing the price of those shares to rise. And when suddenly a large holder of the stock decides to sell it, the price falls sharply. This forces speculators to sell shares in a hurry, making the stock price collapse. Those who sold them at the peak make a profit, and those who didn't sell in time take a loss. This happens when there is a lot of free money on hand, when the store is full of goods and auto dealers have no idea who they should sell last year's model, even at a discount. An important note, the first sign that a financial bubble is about to burst is when stock prices rise sharply and there is a huge rush on the stock exchange. At this point, some may have recalled the Bitcoin case. 100 years have passed and nothing has changed. But let's get back to the subject. Thursday, October 24th, 1929 is considered to be the beginning of the active phase of the Great Depression. On the eve, anxious investors started to sell off the overpriced stocks they knew were worthless. Consequently, the stock market crash occurred just as many people had feared. Nearly 13 million shares were dumped that day. One Black Thursday, though, was not enough to destroy the stock market. 5 days later, on Tuesday, October 29th, another 16 million shares were sold following another wave of the stock panic. Dozens of millions of shares turned out to be worthless, but the worst thing is that most of the large stocks were bought with money borrowed from banks. Needless to say, these dollars could never return to the home bank again, causing more than half of the U.S. banks, a little over 7,000, to cease existing. So, what choice did the manufacturer have? Right. Reduce the rate of production, strictly optimize costs, fire employees, and cut wages firmly for those who were left. At that point, the workers' purchasing power was severely reduced, even though the prices in the stores had dropped threefold. For example, chicken, which had cost 38 cents a pound, was down to 12 cents. The price of a dozen eggs was down from 50 cents to 12 cents, and gasoline was down from 10 cents a gallon to 6 cents. Once again, due to the reduced purchasing power and lower prices, manufacturers were taking a loss. Meanwhile, losses made it necessary to further reduce wages, optimize costs, and lay off employees. This economic process is called the deflationary spiral. Another highly important factor contributing to the Depression is often ignored. It even has got its own name, Dust Bowl, which refers to a drought-stricken region of the southern plains in the United States that suffered severe dust storms during the dry period of the 1930s. Obviously, there were no good harvests in the region. Strong winds and stifling dust swept through Texas to Nebraska, killing people and livestock. The Dust Bowl exacerbated the crushing economic effects of the Great Depression and forced many farmers to migrate in desperation to find work and a better life. Franklin Roosevelt, who had won the presidential election in 1932, started actively dealing with the causes and effects of the Depression in his first 100 days in office. The first thing he did was to suspend the operation of all banks. A bank was allowed to resume operations only after a rigorous examination by the federal authorities. If the bank could operate, it received federal financial aid. In fact, Roosevelt partially nationalized the banks while also assisting private financial institutions. This fact shows how much people trust the newly elected president, who encouraged Americans to bring their savings back to the banks, and by the end of the month, almost 3/4 of the banks had reopened. Among the first decrees of the new president was the order to abolish the prohibition law that had been enforced during the 1920s. Obviously, the law was a very controversial step, driven more by religious and moral principles than by common sense. But to avoid running into obvious contradictions with a certain class of Americans, he made it in 2 steps. First, he allowed the sale of beer, and by the end of the year, he had approved the 21st Congressional Amendment and permanently repealed prohibition. In the next video, we will talk more about prohibition and its far-reaching consequences. Roosevelt's New Deal changed the U.S. federal government drastically and permanently, increasing its size and scope, especially its role in the economy. He promised that he would act quickly and assured Americans that he was fighting an emergency situation, just as if a foreign enemy had invaded the country. His speech reassured Americans that they had elected someone who was not afraid to take bold steps to solve the country's problems. When analyzing the causes of the Great Depression, economists refer to 2 theories, monetarist and the Keynesian. The first suggests that the sharp economic decline was the result of a normal recession and that the contraction of the money supply led to the economic collapse. That is, the reasons lie in money. Supporters of Keynesian theory tend to think that everything spun due to a loss of confidence in producers and banks, leading to a sharp decline in consumption and investment. Naturally, Roosevelt was aware of that, but he did things his own way. First of all, after the bank decree, he adopted a code of peer competition, which basically forced small corporations to merge into large ones. This decree also allowed the organization of labor unions and guaranteed farmers' indebtedness. It meant that Congress passed a bill under which wheat, dairy, tobacco, and corn farmers were paid to leave their fields fallow in order to eliminate agricultural surpluses and raise prices. In the long run, the prices of agricultural products were supposed to level out. Indeed, under government guarantees, farmers sometimes were forced to cut out livestock and dispose of crops to raise prices, which seemed irrational to many people given the threat of starvation. Then, there were many different decrees and codes. Only someone with a deep knowledge of political economy, finance, investment, and crisis measures could speak of their effectiveness. However, considering that the Depression didn't recede until 1939, there was still unemployment, the economy continued to fall, people felt anger and lost their faith about the future, so the effectiveness of Roosevelt's measures was average. So, in the spring of 1935, Roosevelt launched a second, more aggressive series of federal programs. Sometimes it is called the Second New Deal. In April of that year, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, was established. Its mission was to oversee federal tasks, but the WPA had no influence on private business. Thus, the activities of the department focused on the construction of facilities, such as post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks, and also provided work for artists, writers, theater directors, and musicians. A huge advantage of Roosevelt's New Deal lay in the fact that in the late 1930s, the United States passed social legislation that cemented the principles of the functioning of all American society. A civilized form of regulation of the economy and social life was realized. Before 1929, nothing like this had ever been attempted in the U.S. Who knows how it would have ended, if not for World War II, with Roosevelt's decision to support Great Britain and France against Germany and the other powers. It accelerated defense production, creating more and more jobs in the manufacturing sector. The expanding industrial production and the widespread conscription started in 1942 reduced the unemployment rate to below pre-Depression levels. The Great Depression finally ended, and the United States turned its attention to the global nature of World War II. Okay, we got to the bottom of the perturbations in the U.S. economy, and now, to make all our stories put into one picture, let's meet black gold. Yep, you got it right, oil, and people who skillfully handled it. Very skillfully. Standard Oil. Have you ever heard the expression, "He who works all day has no time to make money"? Sounds like nonsense, right? Meanwhile, the words belong to the first ever dollar billionaire and business shark of the oil market in the U.S. It is not about assembling some Macintosh or Apple in a garage. Sorry, Steve, it's all about oil. Stand in awe. Today, we are going to tell you about John Davison Rockefeller. By the way, don't mistake him for his son, John Rockefeller Jr. It seems that the parents lacked imagination, and now it's up to us to deal with it. Let's just forget about the Masons and world conspiracies. You've surely already considered that, yes? Give it a rest, man. It's not serious. We're going to discuss only business, so to speak. And when it came to business, this guy was really good. He caused such a stir in the U.S. oil market that the oil industry gods freaked out. As a result, he created a giant company modestly called Standard Oil. If we get in a DeLorean and ask Doc and Marty McFly to drop us off in mid-19th century America, do you remember the Back to the Future movie? Of course you do. Well, first of all, we will be shocked, and secondly, we will see that the U.S. already knew about oil at that time, except that it was being collected wherever it could be. Whether it was a puddle on the surface or some dripping in a mine, and a bottle or two was collected. We wouldn't even call it mining. There was no electricity in the United States back then. The source of light was lamps, which were filled with all kinds of crap that could burn. Sometimes it was an explosive slurry that could explode, so that at least you had to change paint on the walls. Sometimes people used whale oil, but whales are not endless. At that time, people almost killed all the whales because of that. To make a long story short, the whales were saved by kerosene. Yes, don't laugh, people invented kerosene from oil and voila, the whales were safe. They probably even celebrate kerosene Thanksgiving. So all those who were collecting oil in bottles from puddles were relying on kerosene. It guaranteed the demand for oil, but to make big profits, they had to increase production. The party began in 1859, when former railroad conductor Edward Drake, known as Colonel Drake, drilled the first well, about 69 feet deep in Pennsylvania. If only he had known how those 69 feet would change the U.S. economy and living standards. This way of extracting oil made things go much more briskly. In addition to Pennsylvania, other states joined in. Pretty soon, everyone was drilling. that would have its impact. Unregulated markets, lots of companies, huge supply, but then John Davison Rockefeller got wind of the discovery. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York. John was the eldest son. Today, when you hear Rockefellers, you immediately think of immense fortunes. It wasn't always like that. John's father was a weird guy who seemed to be a woodcutter at first, but later, perhaps struck by a tree, he declared himself a botanical doctor and started selling miraculous elixirs that cured all diseases. Anyway, he was engaged in shady affairs. He spent all his time somewhere else, but not home. Everything fell on his mother's shoulders. John was a hard worker. He made his living helping neighbors, raising turkeys, selling sweets. In short, a hustler at heart. In 1853, his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where John attended school and then grinded away at accounting studies in a college. In 1855, at the age of 16, he took a job as an office clerk in a commission firm in Cleveland. Just imagine, a 16-year-old boy was already working in an office. You would think he'd stop there, but not at all. John quit the company. Whether the guy got bored or realized that it wasn't up to him to work as an employee, soon he found a partner and they opened a trading company, Clark and Rochester. They traded hay, meat, grain, and other stuff that everybody needed all the time. The Civil War broke out and the guys arranged for supplies for the army, making a lot of bucks. John's instincts did not ignore the rising demand for kerosene. He made a timely acquaintance with the talented chemist Samuel Andrews and kept an eye on the oil bustle in Pennsylvania. Damn it, John, what are you? Where did you get that gut feeling? Only a blind man could not see that the oil industry was going to boom. Well, John was not blind at all, and in the very early 1860s, he, together with his trading company partner and chemist Samuel Andrews, launched the oil business in Cleveland. Moreover, they did not just start sucking oil from Mother Earth, but also started processing oil into excellent kerosene, selling it to those who were afraid of the dark, and kerosene was needed in every home. Then they bought a couple of ready-drilled wells in Pennsylvania and drilled a few themselves in Ohio. Anyway, business boomed. Now, a few words about John's partner in the trading company. His name was Morris Clark, and he came to the U.S. from England. As a businessman, he was also quite good. But just as the oil adventures began, whether they had a quarrel with John Rockefeller or John had a grudge against migrant workers, in 1865, John bought Clark's stake in the company at auction for an insane sum of $72,500. Now, those who sold bitcoins for $500 must be experiencing a similar feeling. That marks the beginning of the Rockefeller and Andrews Oil Company. In 1865, they would earn about $200,000. Thank you, Clark. But they weren't the only smart ones. The company was one of 30 oil refineries in Cleveland. Oil production went up and down. The price was bouncing like a ball on a basketball court. And of course, the frequent price drops were a painful shot in the growing ass of John's oil business. John would not be John if he simply left things as they were. In Cleveland, he found an already successful refinery owner, and they made an alliance. Jointly, they had major influence in the oil industry in Ohio, so they could affect the oil price in the region. It was the first partnership and expansion of the company. The first, but not the last. In Ohio, more and more kerosene lamps were burning on Rockefeller kerosene. John Rockefeller was clearly determined to become the big boss in the oil industry. He kept convincing the oilmen to join his gang. A reminder, there was a lot of competition nearby, i.e. an oversupply of oil was causing prices to drop sharply. So joining the reputable Uncle John wasn't the worst idea. Moreover, he was also improving the quality of the kerosene he produced. Rockefeller's kerosene was cleaner and didn't stink like other producers' products. Besides, he introduced pipelines. Anyway, he wasn't slowing down, but only growing. So, in 1870, Rockefeller merged some of the adjoining companies to create Standard Oil. Is it a wonderful story of partnership? Well, not all events were so amicable. John was forcing his competitors to join Standard Oil. This monster had arranged with the railway officials to carry Standard Oil's oil products at ridiculously low prices. Meanwhile, the fares for the competitors should be sky high. A cold-blooded premeditation, like your ex-girlfriend's heart. As a result, Standard Oil got a great opportunity to lower the price of its kerosene, which was also the most luxurious, so that the competitors would damn all the oil gods, bowing down to John or self-destructing. Nothing personal, just business. Nobody likes figures, but you should know that these obscene Standard Oil tricks reduced the price of kerosene from 58 cents to 26 cents. Customers were excited since now they could keep the light on in the bathroom all night long. The dialogue with the competitors looked something like this. Outside our company, no one has a chance, but we'll give everybody a chance to come in. You have to give us your oil refinery, and I'll give you Standard Oil stock or cash, whatever you prefer, for the price we bid on it. It will be for your own good. Between February and March 1872, 21 of Cleveland's 26 refineries were purchased. I would not like to stand in the way of such a monster, especially on the railway. John Rockefeller kept being fierce and took complete control of the Cleveland refining industry. Can you imagine how many curses were sent to John back then? I mean, how the hell he didn't get killed? By 1879, he owned 90% of the refining capacity in all the United States. 90%, and that empire was only growing. In 1882, the Standard Oil Company and its subsidiaries, which were engaged in oil production, refining, and marketing, were merged into a trust. It is when all the partner companies seem to be owned by the partners, but in fact belong to one person, and all decisions are made by that person. And in fact, that person was John Davison Rockefeller. And that's a fucking monopoly all over the US. The monopoly is simple. It's not a board game, although it's that too. First of all, it is an organization which is so influential in its field that it can do whatever it wants with the market. If they want, they'll drop prices, squash any unwanted competitor, and so forth. Everything is well designed. They have their own people everywhere, even in the government. It's kind of unhealthy competition. Various lawsuits have been filed in Ohio against Standard Oil, but all of them have not progressed on a large scale. It seemed to be a positive thing since the management was competent, knowledgeable, and had brought the oil industry to a very high level. But the Standard Oil Trust could now exert influence at a state level, and the state does not favor that kind of thing. Well, what do you think happened next? Well, naturally, the big men got involved. In 1890, John Sherman, a senator from Ohio, proposed an antitrust law allowing the federal government to liquidate any businesses that prohibited competition. What a sly-ass senator. And the Standard Oil Trust was just a model of such an establishment. In 1892, the Ohio Attorney General filed a lawsuit against Rockefeller and his company. The state won the case, but Standard Oil appealed the decision. Then, in 1911, the United States Supreme Court ultimately ruled that Standard Oil should cease to exist. Then the company broke up into many subsidiaries. Several of them retained Standard Oil in their names. In the 1930s, huge oil reserves were discovered in the United States. This crashed the price of the black liquid. It also coincided with the Great Depression we covered in the previous video. During these hard times, many of the companies merged and changed their names. An interesting fact, some of them still exist today and are actually oil splashes of the Standard Oil giant. The story of John Davison Rockefeller is an insane example of business success and talent. He was also a big philanthropist, but that's another story. Now let's go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States. So before the light bulb and the electric grid appeared everywhere in the country, we remember that kerosene was used as fuel for lighting. Well, it had another competitor, ethanol, or simply alcohol. And at the best of time, its production even reached 25 million gallons a year. However, competing with the oil industry is a lost cause, as we know. Whether it was a coincidence or our old fellow Standard Oil had a hand in it, the alcohol production became taxable. As a result, the development of the alcohol industry was slowed down and the volume of alcohol production decreased. Now, let's talk a little about cars. What does it have to do with cars? Well, just a moment and you'll get everything. As we already know, at the end of the 19th century in the United States, cars powered by internal combustion engines stepped onto the scene timidly, or rather drove out. Those were not the engines that smoked steam all around and demanded water. They were the very real ancestors of modern engines. At the beginning of the 20th century, automobile production in the United States continued to grow even faster. Now here's another curious fact. These first internal combustion engines were designed primarily to run on alcohol. That's right. Once the alcohol tax was abolished in 1906, ethanol was actively used as a fuel for automobiles. You had to buy 2 bottles of bourbon for yourself and for your iron horse. Surely gasoline kicked in the door and broke into the automobile industry, but all that happened after. In the meantime, even Henry Ford's brainchild, the Model T, and other cars produced back then were originally designed to run on alcohol fuel. That's right, our genius Henry Ford hoped that a flammable and boozy liquid made from corn, for example, would be the main fuel for automobiles. Well, who knows what he was hoping for, but it didn't work out that way. It was the drunk farmer's fault. A drunken salesman, too. A drunken conductor, a drunken factory worker, and even a drunken policeman. In short, everyone in the United States in the early 20th century was drunk, or almost everybody. Indeed, without exaggeration, it was turning into the great scourge of American society. People in the U.S. at the time were massively drinking alcohol with or without any reason. Anyway, some part of society got worried that they wouldn't have enough alcohol. Well, just kidding, they got seriously worried. Many people started to realize the dangers of mass alcohol consumption. A number of anti-alcohol societies were formed. As a rule, these were religious authorities and women's associations, which led to the so-called anti-saloon movement. Bourbon and other hard liquor opponents tore their throats out in squares and streets, pressuring the government to ban all this fun, and finally, their voices were heard. On December 17, 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The basic meaning was the manufacture, sale, or transportation of liquor within the country was prohibited. This also applied to the importation of alcohol from other countries. Thus began His Majesty's Prohibition. We could tell a whole great story about that time, how Prohibition was broken within an hour of its passage, how criminal elements became rich, how Canada profited from the whole affair, how sly pharmacists prescribed medicinal whiskey at extra cost, and other interesting facts, but that's not what interests us. Well, assholes, how should cars be fueled now? The 18th Amendment just ended the possibility of using ethanol as fuel. By that time, there had been a lot of cars all around. Should people fuel up at illegal liquor stores run by bootlegger gangsters? So then they'll ask you, why did you go to jail? And you'll say, for half a tank of fuel. Well, that's a shitty scenario. But wait, we have oil. People have learned to make a lot of things out of it, including gasoline. Back then, cars could also be fueled with gasoline. It became the only real alternative in the existing situation, but it wasn't all that simple. There were some problems with gasoline too. Both gasoline and alcohol actually existed at the same time. So why did the creators of automobiles prefer ethanol-based fuel over gasoline? Because there was a chance to get drunk in the garage right out of the fuel tank? Of course not. Alcohol burned cleaner, it didn't cause a lot of emissions, and most importantly, the engines ran much smoother and better on ethanol. Why? Well, let's try to figure that out. In simple words, if the fuel was of poor quality, it was very bad for internal combustion engines. The answer lies partly in the name of the engine, internal combustion, meaning that something burns on the inside and it is somehow ignited. Things are like that. I hope you have at least a small idea of what an engine is. Its main component is the cylinder, inside which the piston goes up and down. It looks somewhat like a medical syringe, but in the syringe, the piston goes all the way to the top, while in the engine, the piston doesn't go all the way up, leaving a little space in the cylinder above the piston. The remaining space is intended for the combustion of fuel, being the combustion chamber. Once the fuel burns, it creates pressure, which pushes the piston down, and it transfers energy from the crankshaft to the wheels, which spin, and we can successfully drive wherever we want to go. Now, this is just a very simplified explanation, but we're not at university or anything, and no need to go over everything in detail. So when the piston goes up, it compresses fuel until it rises completely to the top position, where the spark flashes in the combustion chamber with the spark plug, and boom, the piston goes down. Then it goes up. Same thing happens all over again, and so on. And there is one important thing. The more we compress the fuel before giving it the spark, the more energy we get, and the more power we can squeeze out of the engine. And alcohol was perfect for this purpose. But gasoline could blow up during compression before the piston reached the upper point. Just like that. I'm going to explode since you're pushing me. That is, much earlier than necessary. It turns out that the explosion occurred ahead of time and pushed the piston down while it was still going up. Well, that sounds like bullshit, and a bullshit that was killing the engine. That was called detonation, and the property of fuel to resist detonation is measured by the octane number. I think we've made things clear. The numbers you see at gas stations, such as 87, 89, or 93, are the octane number. And the higher the number is, the more fuel can be compressed without threat of detonation. Back then, the octane rating of gasoline was around 50, which is very low. So you need to figure out what kind of gasoline to put in your car so as not to kill your engine. Open the tank hatch for sure, it's all written there. The octane number of alcohol was just perfect for the engines, but outside, it was goddamn prohibition. It was necessary to do something about the gasoline, otherwise there would have been too many orders for the service stations. A bunch of people got together, including oilmen, car manufacturers, and chemists, and they tried to figure out what to do. I wish they hadn't even started. Remember what we were talking about in the very beginning? Everything has a reason. And so, about an hour of narration later, we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Ford gave the world a cheap car. General Motors gave the world a diversity of cars. Delco Company, a part of General Motors, killed ICE competitors. Standard Oil Company provided the entire country with oil products. And then Prohibition suddenly came, a ban which left no alternative to gasoline. Of course, there's a theory according to which Rockefeller thought this through in advance and promoted a ban on alcohol, because that state of business was working in his favor for the oil market. But we'll leave that for the conspiracy theorists. The most important thing, by that time, the car became ingrained in people's lives. The entire logistics was based on it. If vehicles start to fail to function massively, this would trigger economic collapse. People needed an urgent solution, and they found it. So here's what we have. Gasoline ruins engines, but you can't use alcohol because it's outlawed. Cars need to run on something that doesn't destroy them. One gets used to the good stuff quickly, and it's hard to imagine the U.S. economy of that time without cars. Moreover, there were rumors that oil might run out. Anyway, the atmosphere was nervous, like waiting in line at the venereal disease doctor's office. In such a stressful environment, two bright, inventive minds were working on that problem under the roof of the research division of General Motors Corporation, established in 1919. Chemist Thomas Midgley and his boss, engineer Charles Franklin Kettering. A particularly attentive viewer will say, hold on, wait a minute, that guy sounds awfully familiar to me. Yes, this is an engineer who invented the starter, and thanks to his invention, he turned out under the wing of General Motors. In addition to the starter, he implemented into the car many other electrical appliances. Generally speaking, Kettering was a useful dude. Thomas Midgley was also a brilliant inventor. Not as great as Kettering, of course, but still, mankind will not forget him either. For example, he invented Freon, a gas for refrigerators that nearly destroyed the ozone layer of the planet when Freon production reached its peak. In fact, if you study Midgley's life more closely, you can see how skillfully he created things that were dangerous to mankind. He was like Thanos in the science world, as if he wanted to exterminate half the population. Nevertheless, he won a lot of awards and patented many inventions. General Motors, jointly with Standard Oil of New Jersey, assigned Kettering and Midgley the difficult task of inventing a gasoline supplement to produce fuel with a high-octane rating and patenting it to make it economically profitable. Such fuel supplements were called additives. The command is given, the command must be fulfilled, and here we go. Midgley started his research. Like Mr. Heisenberg from Breaking Bad, he stayed in the lab day and night. For a long time, the experiments didn't lead to any results. An interesting fact is that Midgley even tried to create alcohol production from oil, so that the oil industry could also run the ethanol business, but he didn't achieve much success in that. A lot of time, energy, and money was wasted. As a result, Thomas Midgley started tearing the hair out in desperation, trying to add anything he can to the gasoline. Virgin's blood, paint, Coca-Cola, oddly enough, and that didn't work either. And then he reached the toxic substances. On December 9th, 1921, he added lead to the gasoline. And oh gods, the engine started running. No detonation. Midgley rushed to Kettering like lightning and told his boss that the Philosopher's Stone had been found. It was the lead, but he cautioned that it was a little bit noxious, or not a little bit. But who cares about harmfulness when engines keep breaking down? The market wanted a solution, and the companies wanted money. Now, here appears to be an option, the production of which would not be difficult or expensive since there was plenty of lead in nature. The main thing is that it could be patented so as to make enormous profits. Midgley had not yet had time to shut down his engine for testing, while GM and Standard Oil managers were already calculating how much revenue they would get from the additive. Of course, this was presented to the chemical company with the right dressing. Everyone was praising Midgley and Kettering, so to speak, and it was a great success. The additive was not pure lead. It was called tetraethyl lead, or TEL. This compound was discovered as early as 1853 by Carl Jacob Levig, professor of chemistry at the University of Zurich. It was a mixture of ethyl chloride, lead, and sodium, but that didn't change the point. Just imagine, something containing lead was about to be added to the tanks. Obviously, nothing good could come out of the exhaust pipe. Still, since people already had some superficial understanding that lead was something rather disturbing, it was decided to emphasize ethyl in the name in order to make it more appealing to the public. General Motors and Standard Oil didn't hesitate long, creating the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation in 1923 and setting up TEL production, asking for help from the more experienced guys at DuPont, the more mass-produced chemistry company. Oh crap, I remember using toilet water labeled DuPont. I wonder if my hair will fall out before my time. Well, come what may. A lark's a lark, but in the U.S. there was a large production of a rather dubious gasoline additive, the effects of which on humans you will soon find out. Well, happy birthday, leaded gasoline. At first, the following events were like the theater of the absurd. Thomas Midgley, while dealing with TEL, got poisoned and even took a leave of absence in January 1923 to improve his health. Earlier, alarming letters expressing concern about the TEL use have been sent from scientific colleagues and the Public Health Service to General Motors, but they were swatted away as pesky flies. Finally, on February 1st, the first commercial sale of leaded gasoline took place in Dayton, Ohio. Hooray! The TEL production had started to develop. No medical tests had been done, none at all, in fact. Soon, Midgley was awarded a medal for the discovery of the anti-detonation effect of tetraethyl leaded gasoline. However, he didn't come for the award because he was taking a break from his brainchild, lying on the beaches of Miami. That same year, 1923, were the first warning signs. 2 employees died due to lead poisoning at the Dayton plant, and many of the employees experienced extremely strange symptoms, such as hallucinations, unsteady gait, and mental disturbances. Most of them would become disabled, and some would end up in an insane asylum for the rest of their lives. Then at the other plants of the Ethel Corporation, the story repeats. There were more deaths, people were going crazy, basically some kind of a mess was going on. An internal inspection revealed that the workers had simply failed to follow safety precautions. Brilliant explanation. Put your gloves on and you'll be fine. Keep working. TEL isn't going to spill itself all over the tanks. More and more people were criticizing everything about TEL, but Ethel didn't care. They don't even hesitate to advertise their products. Their brilliant marketing experts whipped up slogans like, "As an Ethel user, you benefit from significantly increased speed and greater power, faster acceleration, and complete elimination of detonation. Ethylated gasoline has made it possible. Take a ride with Ethel in a high-compression engine and experience lifelong thrills." As for the lifelong feeling, they make a good point. By the way, have you seen the word lead here? Where did that go? Still, Ethel adopted some measures. First, they paid more attention to safety in the factories. They built and improved ventilation systems, issued protective clothing, trained people, and so on. Secondly, seeing that a government-level showdown was about to begin, these sly guys made a pretty good move. Realizing that their own research on the TEL's dangers would have little credibility, they said, "Okay, we need to do more research on the effects of TEL on the human body. Let's get some outside organization involved for more fair evaluation." And for this purpose, they involved an organization that seemed to be third-party but almost friendly to them. As weird as it may sound, this organization was the U.S. Bureau of Mines. That wasn't all. Our clever TEL owners agreed with the Bureau on the remarkable provision that the Bureau would refrain from publishing progress reports in the press, since newspapers tend to give scare headlines and false impressions. This was 100-level impudence. So the issue seemed to be investigated, people seemed to be taken care of, safety measures were introduced, and all those things seemed to be so conscious. In the meantime, TEL had been successfully distributed to the fuel tanks of U.S. cars, money had been deposited, and lead fumes had been blown all over the Ethel plants and dispersed by the wind across the continent. However, sooner or later, all secrets come out. And after another mass poisoning at one of the corporation's plants in 1924, the management had to deal seriously with the press. There were 5 deaths in a very short period of time, and a total of 80% of the staff was affected. Many people had very serious problems. The news of those deaths was the first that Americans heard from the newspapers about the harms of leaded gasoline. The news was delayed too because the management of the company did not make any comment at first. Finally, the press was invited to the Standard Oil headquarters in New York. Thomas Midgley was urgently brought there to explain the situation on his part, and on top of that, the company said that there had been an accident, a sudden release of TEL vapors. In other words, force majeure. Anyway, the guys tried everything they could to get out of the situation. But then, Midgley's performance in front of the press turned to be a real showpiece. Midgley had just regained his health after being poisoned by his own additive, but he decided to demonstrate the safety of TEL to everyone. He washed his hands in TEL, breathed its vapors for a while, and then dried himself with a handkerchief. Well, thank you, Thomas, for not drinking the stuff. One way or another, all these tricks did not help much, and the society started getting angry, while the newspapers kept reporting incidents at the Ethel factories. But the most important thing was that people continued to suffer, and in 1925, the production of TEL was restricted by the New Jersey authorities. However, just a year later, a special committee appointed to investigate the incidents concluded that there was no valid reason to ban the sale of ethyl gasoline. The committee found that all reported fatalities and serious injuries occurred either in the TEL production process or during the blending procedures, they said. In short, the conclusions are as follows, quote, Workers involved in production can get poisoned if they're not careful, but for everyone else, TEL seems to be harmless, end quote. After such a favorable report for Ethel, the faucets were reopened and TEL appeared in the gas stations once again. Still, the same committee added, quote, "Right now it's not clear how the population is affected by TEL, so we need to investigate it further just to be on the safe side." However, this story went nowhere. No one wanted to take the expense of any observations and experiments, and that's when Robert Kehoe appeared on the scene of the debate about the harms of TEL to humans. Charles Kettering hired Kehoe to fix up the production and create rules for handling TEL. Kehoe was very agile, clever, and sly. In 1925, he was already the chief medical consultant of the Ethel Corporation, defending the version that the use of TEL in gasoline was safe. Soon enough, he would become kind of an influential figure in the industry and the healthcare system. Although his reputation would be severely compromised, but we'll get to that later. This rascal decided to protect the company from any attacks regarding the damage caused by TEL. Since he had already realized that no one had investigated anything and would hardly want to, he decided to do the research himself. He made good use of the situation. He found that a certain level of lead in the body was quite normal. God only knows how he determined that level. Finally, he added, "If anyone gets strong evidence that our product is really toxic, we'll pack our bags and stop producing TEL." The sad thing is that it was not just about Ethel, but about leaded gasoline in general. Since the patent was expired, the production of the additive started to actively expand geographically, moving to other countries. In fact, there were only his values to indicate fixed norms for lead concentration in the body, figures based on his own biased research. Nobody seems to be worried except some cases where people go crazy, but well, that doesn't mean it was caused by the lead, right? And do you remember what happened next? That's right, the Great Depression began. Mankind as a whole didn't care about research. When a person has no job, no home, and no food, they generally won't care much about lead levels in the atmosphere. And if you remember that the internal combustion engine had no counterparts at the time, and conventional gasoline was destroying transportation, it becomes clear how necessary TEL was to the economy. Meanwhile, the TEL distribution reached significant levels. In 1936, the additive was in 90% of gasoline in the U.S. Well, that's the way things turned out. The company had almost closed down, but ended up taking over the market. How? How is it possible that people didn't want to pay proper attention to their health? They just went along with some guy from a company that manufactures a dubious additive. But not everyone agreed. Do you think there are too many bad guys in our TEL story? Way too many, right? However, by the rules of the genre and universal equilibrium, wherever there's a villain, there's always a hero too. And he showed up. Among the cornfields and farms of Iowa, on June 2, 1922, Clair Patterson was born. Sound familiar? It's exactly the same Superman story, but Patterson didn't have any superpowers. Instead, he was a very stubborn man with a keen intellect. Patterson devoted himself to science, more specifically geochemistry. That's the science of the chemical composition of the Earth, something like geology but at an advanced level. And during World War II, Uncle Sam asked Patterson and a whole group of scientists to play with uranium and create some kind of explosive contraption. They succeeded and developed the atomic bomb. However, after the first use in Japan, Patterson was horrified by what they had created, so he switched to the peaceful application of his talents. He didn't want to be the bad guy. Perhaps he felt guilty before mankind, therefore trying to work on useful projects. Well, let's pretend you want to know how old is our planet. Well, you Google this question and see that the age of our Mother Earth is 4.54 billion years old. So that age was calculated by Clair Patterson. He succeeded due to the phenomenon of radioactive decay. It seems that I need to clarify what sort of trick this is. It's more complicated than the example of the piston and cylinder. Let's imagine a substance. It consists of molecules. Molecules are made up of atoms, and inside an atom there's a nucleus. There are substances in which the atoms are acting turbulently. They emit different particles or whatever. In general, they behave actively and unstably. This activity is called radioactive decay. And the trick is that during this decay, after a certain period of time, one substance that decays will gradually form another substance. What do you think uranium turns into when it decays? Well, that turns into lead. And if you know the decay time of uranium, then by the ratio of uranium to lead in any sample, you can understand how old the sample is. But how did the scientists figure it out? To understand this ratio, all these atoms and molecules should somehow be weighed. Mass spectral analysis was used to do that. Well, that's a real mind blow. I suggested instead of torturing yourself, you just understand that Patterson got some kind of scale on which he could weigh uranium and lead molecules and compare to their volumes. Thus, Patterson decided to take a piece of meteorite, which was supposedly the same age as the Earth, and examine the ratio of uranium and lead in it, comparing it with the decay of time and getting the age of the Earth. I wonder where you can go and get a piece of a meteorite like that. Is there some kind of meteorite fair for scientists? Well, either way, he succeeded, doing a great job, but during the process he faced a very strange phenomenon. When he started to figure out how much lead was in the first meteorite sample, he got over-the-top values. There was clearly more lead than there should have been. Patterson decided that it was due to some previous experiments, after which the sample or the equipment had been poorly cleaned. As a result, he created sterile conditions and brought the research to an end. However, something triggered him, so he decided to revisit the issue of lead content and the surrounding environment. He was surprised to see that even in samples where there should be no lead at all, the amount of lead was off the charts. Patterson realized that he was living in the age of lead, found in cans, pipes, glass, paint, and so on, but he also realized that the largest amount of lead is probably contained in leaded TEL gasoline. Of course, he also realized that there are no high-quality studies on the issue. There weren't any studies? Well, there will be. So Patterson plunged headlong into his work. He rushed around the world and collected samples from various places, from the ocean depths and water surface, from the ground and air in different parts of the world. He even went so far as to study ancient mummies to compare the lead saturation of the bones of modern man and the man who lived many years ago. From time to time, he had already drawn concrete conclusions and published the first reports in national newspapers on the harms of leaded gasoline. Meanwhile, TEL had been successfully used for a whole 3 decades. Once something has become a part of life, it's hard to believe that it can be extremely harmful. On top of that, Kehoe was calming everyone down by mocking Patterson's conclusions. Back then, Kehoe was already an influential figure. In short, Patterson's first studies were taken lightly. Do you think he gave up? Hell no. Despite the tons of bullshit he was exposed to, he persisted in his search for facts and evidence. Finally, he reached some horrifying conclusions. The concentration of lead in the atmosphere of the Earth is 1,000 times higher than its natural content. 1,000 times, and the content of lead in the human body is probably exceeded by 100 times. Kehoe spewed something like, "What geologist can understand about biology?" in response to such loud statements. Not to mention that in 1965, the Society of Toxicologists also ridiculed Patterson's article, timing it as science fiction. Yet Patterson didn't care at all. The dogs bark, but the caravan goes on. If that's not enough for you, fine. Patterson went first to Greenland and then to the South Pole and got ice samples from different depths, comparing them layer by layer with the samples taken on the surface. The result was, samples showed a 300-fold increase in lead levels from the 1700s to the current date, but the sharpest spike happened in the last 30 years. The increase occurred precisely during the period of mass distribution of TEL. What more proof do you need? It's all man's fault. In parallel, there was accumulating medical evidence that exposure to low levels of lead, well below Kehoe levels, could be harmful to children, reducing their mental capacity later in life. Later, the connection between lead and an increase in crime would also be explored, as lead made a person aggressive by affecting the nervous system. Society started to wake up. Patterson devoted a huge part of his life to proving there was a huge mistake that should be resolved immediately. Finally, for the first time, he was listened to, and in 1976, Kehoe's conclusions about lead standards and human exposure were declared nonsense. Next, the manufacturers of leaded gasoline were ordered to reduce the lead content of their gasoline. It was only in the 1980s that Patterson research data was truly recognized. The final point in the use of TEL in the United States was reached on December 31st, 1995. Patterson didn't live long enough to see his greatest triumph. We should never forget his hard and diligent work to save humanity. It is a rare case when the whole world should know this man. Instead, there is almost no one who knows him. Kettering, Midgley, Kehoe, GM Management, DuPont, Ethel, Standard Oil. What have you done? This whole series of events and decisions is a terrible example of greed, human ignorance, abuse of authority, and most importantly, the devaluation of human life. It was not without fatal consequences. In any case, such examples should remind us of what the lust for power, domination, and enrichment can lead to. Imagine, Ford Company and GM were stormily developing car manufacturing to make people's lives easier. And so the nation would not drink itself into a grave bugger, prohibition was created. But because of it, gasoline became more popular, and they had to improve it with additions. And high-quality kerosene, instead of killing whales and questionable explosive liquids, they were generally sound steps indeed, and correct ones. But behind all these benign designs was constantly hiding a black shadow of reckless greed of those who saw only a chance of getting rich and becoming influential and important, and not tarring their reputation against all odds. The story of Tell shows us how, next to bright and brilliant ideas, dire consequences may grow, which could have an impact on several generations, on the whole planet.